Okay, so I'm Joe Webby. I head up the Entrepreneur in Residence program for Harvard Alumni Entrepreneurs. Please feel free to submit your questions. We received a lot of questions in advance, but if you have any questions as we're discussing today with our guest, feel free to ask them. Our guest today, Vishal Punwani, he's the CEO of Sophya. They use data science and cutting edge AI in building the Spotify of learning future of work skills. Vishal is a medical doctor and EIR with HAE, a startup advisor at Oxford University and the iLab. His startup, Sophya, was previously an iLab VIP team, as well as a Launch Lab X startup for alumni. Vishal, thank you so much for joining us today.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Before we go into the questions, if you could just kind of give us a background on what Sophya does, and then we'll jump right into the questions.
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, thanks for joining. This is going to be fun. Hopefully we get lots of questions answered today. So let me just start by giving you a quick snapshot of my background, so you know how to sort of what I might be able to help with. So while I was in medical school from 2013 to 2016, I started working at Khan Academy. If you guys are probably familiar with Khan Academy, and I became their top teaching fellow in health and medicine. When I worked there, that sort of helped me to learn so much about the world of online education and just what education could do if sort of blasted out at scale, right? After I graduated med school, I started working at the WHO in Geneva, and my sort of role there was I had to work with some colleagues, including someone who might be on this call, Harrison, if you're here. Hey, dude. We built a platform for sort of blasting out education again to different member states around the world, and also collecting sort of data and other information back from these countries to help guide what the WHO should do, right, in particular sort of areas. And so all of that information and background, I guess, helped me and my co-founder to decide to build Sophya. We saw this huge gap in sort of education that other verticals had covered really well. And so what I mean by that is, if you think about something like Amazon or Spotify or Facebook or Google, all of these, or Pinterest actually is a great example as well. All of these companies have essentially revolutionized their entire vertical by using data about user behavior and actions and needs and desires and all of these different things to sort of give the next user a much better experience, right? If you think about the reason Joe said Spotify of future of work learning is because if you think about what music search was before Spotify, we all had to go out on the internet and go on YouTube and rip music and then put them on our iPod or iPhone or whatever it is. And then we'd listen, and then 2 weeks later we'd get bored and we'd have to go back to YouTube and rip more music, right? It was like a terrible experience. It was such a time sink. And what Spotify did was that they said, hey, we're going to give everybody all of the music, and we're just going to look at how people listen to stuff, and we'll build these listener profiles and these clusters, right? It's all data science. And we are going to, anytime a new listener jumps on, we're going to know where to maybe put them in the cluster as a start, right? And lo and behold, as you start listening to music, you kind of, tweak where the algorithm puts you in that cluster until you get closer to what's true for you. And so we decided, we are seeing problems with people learning from the internet all over the place. It's not really that easy to learn on the web. You have to know what you want to know. You have to know what order to learn things in. You have to know where your gaps are and what context you're learning it for. There's so much that's missing. It's not as easy as just jumping onto Google and saying, hey, I want to be a programmer. I want to be a doctor, or a whatever it is you want to be, right? It's not that simple. And using the work of other people who have done it before and been successful, there's actually a really great way, an easy way to do it with data. And that's what we do at Sophya. So we primarily work with B2C, so we go directly to students, and we also.
No, I was just muting one of our participants. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, that's right. Yeah. And then we also work with large institutions, schools, companies, in giving them a great place to learn and sort of tools to help them learn. So that is the backstory on Sophia. Um, when we get
Great.
to questions like team and fundraise and stuff, we can talk a bit more about that specifically.
Great. Yeah, we'll do, I'm sure, go deeper into Sophia and how the platform works. We're going to start tackling some of these questions. First one from Jujubi. She's asking, how did you determine, who's the right kind of core team, the founding team? And then did you ever consider going as a solo founder?
Um, so that is a great question. That's a question that like so many people will ask, right? So you're right. You're thinking about things the right way if you're asking that question. So you, in general terms, having really strong co-founders who are complementary to what you do, so not overlapping what you do, but complementary, is a really good idea. In very few cases, it could be a good idea to have overlapping skill sets. Maybe if there's just like a ton of technical work to do, you could consider having two technical co-founders. But in most cases, like 99% of cases, you really want to have like overlapping skill sets among your co-founders. Um, in terms of solo foundership, there's a lot to do in this sort of world. And so you really have to be cognizant of what you're signing up for if you go the solo founder route. So, for example, if you think that there's no speed urgency, then sure, you can try out the solo foundership for a while until you get to sort of a breaking point where you feel like you need to add somebody in to help you carry the load. If you feel that it's an equity thing and you don't want to bring someone in because of an equity thing, and that's like a lot of people have that thought, then you are going to have to wrap your head around the fact that unless you have something that can produce cash like through customers really, really fast, you're going to just have to get comfortable with some level of dilution. So really, the best thing you could do to improve the chances of your startup being successful is to find co-founders with complementary skill sets. You know, there's like lists of 20 things that kill startups. Every single one of them is true. And so whatever you can do to sort of like vaccinate yourself against all of those things, not saying 100% success if you cover all your bases, obviously, but the more you can do to cover your bases, the better. And finding a smart, driven co-founder who's motivated by the same values and outcomes as you, that's a whole conversation in itself, is really, really, really important.
Vishal, how did you sell the vision to your co-founders? I mean, how did you find your initial founding team?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you only ever want to push forward a vision with somebody together, i.e. a co-founder, if they believe as much as you do, right? And they may believe for different reasons. Like, for example, with my technical co-founder, like, you know, they may be just inspired by the data science craziness of it all, right? But they really want to see the change happen in the world from a technical point of view. I want to see the change happen in the world from a socioeconomic sort of movement point of view, right? An equity of learning point of view. That's how I got to where I am. So for me, like remaking the world in that vision is really important to me. Um, in terms of selling people, there's a there's something here to be said about authenticity. If you sort of emanate your authentic self, the people who you end up bringing into your network will be people who appreciate what you're doing because of what you're doing, right? And then you don't really have to worry about sort of misrepresenting or like convincing people. We actually have a rule that's number one in our values list that says no hostages. And what that means is like we only bring people in who really, really want to be here and who really want the change that we're trying to do. And so in terms of that being applied to a co-founder, the way that it worked for me, I kept asking my co-founder, Emma, who worked with me at Khan Academy and worked with me at the WHO, I kept asking her, like, really annoying questions to like help me think through logic of all these things back in our early stages. And eventually she just got so intrigued that she was like, hey, can we just like do this thing together? So, you know, that for me was a great way of gauging fit, right? To see if this person is so interested that they would like be keen on going in together on this. And then on the other person's side, you can see like, well, where do their values lie, and how does that line up with your vision? So I recognize that finding a co-founder isn't always that easy, but if you're looking for ways to do that, then we can also discuss that.
Great. I mean, there's so many questions here regarding kind of forming that team. So the next one from Brian, he's asking, what compensation do you believe to be fair for that initial founding team? And you mentioned, you know, you're evaluating Emma, you know, you were kind of discussing the idea. How did you
Mhm.
evaluate the rest of the initial startup team?
Yeah, so we are 18 now. So we have gotten a little bit bigger than just me and the founding team, which was 5 of us initially. So the compensation question is sort of split up into a few pieces. One piece is equity, right? Because in the early days, that's really like pretty much most people's like the only thing that they have to sort of entice people. So in terms of equity, there there are two schools of thought, right? In early stage, one group says, "Hey, we should all split everything equally." And then one group says, well, let's actually look at the roles and what everybody does and blah, 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 and let's sort of split things along those lines. And fortunately, there's some guidance available for both camps. So in the first camp that, you know, let's split everything equally. If you feel that that's the way to go, then, you know, that is an option. But at the end of the day, what many venture firms, if that's what you're after, or, you know, other types of investors, when we should talk about fundraise a bit later, um, what they think is um, if we see even splits of equity across the board, then our initial thought is that there was no thought that went into this, and it was just about gut feeling and fairness. And that's typically never um, the founding team that comes in with like equal equity is typically not the founding team that sort of comes out on the other side, right? And so it doesn't often fairly reflect everybody's investment of time and money. It doesn't reflect what the importance of each role is. It doesn't reflect the um, the most important thing, which is like commitment and time, like gonna put in the hard work and do the startup grind thing for as long as it's needed. So I actually rarely think that an equal equity split is a good idea. On the other side, where you know you're looking to split equity among a group of co-founders but not equally, there's actually groups of people who have done a lot of the hard work for you and put up these like fairly rudimentary calculators that will ask you to name like co-founder 1, 2, 3, 4 or whatever it is, and then like who will be doing what functions primarily, and then you just click calculate and it'll give you like some kind of like estimated split, and then your mileage may vary, right? You can maybe say, well, this person is also doing this and this person's not doing this, so then you can adjust those numbers, but it gives you a good just gut check in terms of starting point. So I can include, I'm putting together a bunch of resources for you guys. So I can include that in the resources.
Great. And then in terms of evaluating the rest of the team, I know you guys were quite large when you actually went through a launch lab. How did you evaluate the rest of that team after the
Yeah.
co-founding team?
So the the short answer is it was kind of like a co-founder effort. So me and Emma, um, because we have very different personality profiles. I'm a maverick. This is like my predictive index personality type, which means that I just love people and I'm an extrovert. And like if I find amazing people, I'm like, dude, you got to join my team, right? Dude or dudette, you know, And then I pass that thought through a filter, which is Emma, who's like, well, hang on a sec, let's just evaluate the need and the fit. And so when we started Launch Lab X, we were like 7 or 8 people. Every person played a very specific role, right? And then as we've grown out, we've never added any fluff or bulk. Every person plays a very specific role, and wears a specific hat with specific objectives and key results that need to happen every month or every quarter. So in terms of evaluating team fit, there's one side that is background, productivity, deliverables, right? Can they get the job done from a technical standpoint? And when I say technical, I don't just mean programming, I mean technical as in work, right? It could be business, it could be marketing, sales. And then the other side of the evaluation is, are they a cultural fit? And that really is our biggest hurdle. If we're super selective about who we bring in, we typically evaluate people for like 6 to 9 months before bringing them into the company. And having people clear bars like that means that you're finding people who are super well aligned and who will come in and be such an additive force to your company. So really, you should be thinking about 2 bars. I'm sure you're already thinking about this, but cultural fit number 1, and then technical fit.
Great. Another question sent in by Susan in the messages. So typically, shares are advised for 1-year cliff, 4-year vesting. She's asking, over what time period do your founders' shares vest?
Yep. So the short answer is the same thing. Many investors, when they decide to invest in your company, they'll say, okay, well, if any of the founders weren't on that vesting schedule initially, a condition of our investment is going to be that we retroactively go and fix all that. And this is now the new thing. And you have to sign the releases and sell back shares if you've sort of not stuck with that. Not every person is like that, but I would say in like 95% of cases that's going to be the deal, particularly if it's a reasonable sized funding round. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is in some cases, certain founders had been working on the idea or the execution of the idea for some period of time beforehand. And so in certain cases, and you guys would know best for your own companies, it's okay to waive a cliff or waive part of a cliff for a founder. That's a very personal decision, and you want to make sure that doesn't have any sort of run-on effects when it comes to fundraising.
Great. Next question from Amma Hashmi. She's asking, how did you so in the idea validation stage, how did you find the right customers to interview, and maybe sort of your validation phase? How did you go about that?
Yeah, so this is also a super dynamic question, because in the early days, that person or group of people who will be your early beta testers or early whatever you want to call it, that group of people will evolve, right? And I don't mean them, that same person evolving. I mean, like, it could be these people in month 1, then it's a totally different set of people, then it's a totally different set of people. And the reason why is because when you first start a venture, you don't actually know if what you're doing, I mean, you have an inkling, right? But you don't actually know for certain that what you're doing is going to be needed by the market or paid for by the market, right? Or accepted by the market in terms of time spent on your platform, right? And so initially, you're basically getting a bunch of beta users on to test out what you're doing and to give you feedback and to tell you what they need. And then through that process, inevitably a bunch of them fall out, and then you basically have to recruit more. But what you show them is not what you showed the first group. So then that process just kind of keeps going, ideally along your vision, right? It can't just be morphing into something that isn't your vision. It has to be along your vision. And to give you an idea of why we were so lucky, for us, selling into enterprise, big institutions, schools, etc., that's a big part of how we make money right now. And so I was very fortunate to have a very strong sort of medical network, because like with deans of med schools and things like that, because of my background as a doctor. And so, and obviously like in medical education, right? So for us, we had a bunch of schools who were so early adopter that they worked with us through our like toddler stage, when we were like grabbing onto furniture and falling and crying, like the whole sort of baby startup stage when you're really finding your legs. I am so grateful every single day that these people stuck with us because they helped us to shape the product to what it is now, right? Which is
Mhm.
something that is like ready for growth and has been growing in that sense. So I think whatever your vertical is, you need to find people who are cheerleaders of you as people, because then they'll be much more forgiving when you inevitably have to go through that toddler stage, right?
What are some like scrappy ways that you would advise to kind of validate the idea when you're just at the idea stage?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that you can do. So presumably you have some connection to your vertical, right? Otherwise, it'd be like
Mhm.
weird if you're starting a company in this place that you don't really have any connection to. That's just weird. And like, I don't mean weird as in like weird. I mean weird as in like you're if you don't know lots about that space, then you
Mhm.
might be setting yourself up for not very good results just because you have to be able to empathize with the problems that people are having to form a really good company, right? And so, what I did in the early days was just simple things, surveys of my core user groups. So surveys of students, surveys of faculty, surveys of administrators, surveys of regular
Mhm.
technical users of different softwares, just to see like where are the pain points, what could we solve, if we solved it in this way, would this be good. But having said that, really there's a quote that stuck with me through the years, and it
Mhm.
is what people say versus what people do versus what people buy are all very different things. And
Mhm.
sometimes those are like Venn diagram circles that have no points of overlap. And so everything that is said to you has to be taken with a grain of salt, because actions speak much louder than words,
Mhm.
and people putting their cash down speaks much louder than anything else. So whatever it is that you decide to do, you need to move on that in terms of your actions and try to validate it outside of just talk, right, from your customer.
So that's a great point. You mentioned that having a connection to that industry. How important is it to have sort of that founder startup fit, founder market fit?
Yeah, it's crucial. It's crucial. And the reason I say that is because you need people to back you, right? People are backing you. They're not necessarily backing the company,
Mhm.
because, for example, in my roles, let's say at Oxford, for example, when I see a startup talk to me about this crazy cool thing that they're building, if the founder doesn't have a background, or wherever it is, Harvard,
Mhm.
not Harvard, wherever it is, if the founder doesn't have like a deep expertise in that area, I get worried, right?
Mhm.
Even though I'm like a mentor advisor, I'm not investing in these companies at the moment. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's because, again, it comes back to that list of like, these are all the reasons that your startup will fail, right? Which ones are you going to check off, right?
Mhm.
And one of those is like, you got to know the ins and outs of your business. You got to be a backable person. And the thing that inspires confidence more than anything is if somebody knows what they're talking about, right?
Mhm.
Then you have, if you're an investor, you're happy to trust this person's judgment. You're happy what they say will check out if you do any digging, and then they'll be happier to fund you. If you're a customer, you're more happy to share the software around or share the product around because you actually believe that the person is meaningfully remaking your sector, right? And that just can't happen from an outsider point of view. I want to talk about some corner cases because they're not in contradiction to this. They are part of this. So if you think about someone like Elon,
Mhm.
who didn't know anything about rocket science, right? Like he was an outsider to NASA, right? And he was an outsider to like space programs. But what he did is he worked his ass off and he learned everything that there is to know about physics and rocket science, right? Which means he then became a great um, um, believable source of truth when it comes to that stuff, right? And that's what, obviously there's lots of other things that were very helpful to him, but
Mhm.
he was certainly not an amateur.
Great. So we're going to jump into the fundraising questions. First one from Natalia. She's asking sort of what was that tipping point for raising outside capital? So you have your team, you validated your idea. What kind of made you pursue the fundraising routes? And also maybe if you can talk about a little bit about the optimal structure. Was it a convertible note or a safe note at the initial stage?
Yeah. Okay. So let's break those questions up a little bit. So I, so the initial founding team was able to get a significant amount of work done without capital. And that's because we have like a gun programmer, you know, back in the day, right? It's four of us, just amazing two programmers, and then Emma for a lot of the sort of strategy and operations and things like that, and then me for like, you know, other things, right? Whatever CEOs do. And so we didn't feel we had to raise capital until we were ready to sort of bring people in full time, or scale a little bit, right? To try to push into early pilots and things like that. So as much as possible, you should try to defer fundraising for as long as you can. Not only will that help you to prove out your ideas, right, in a low budget way, which is very important, but it will also allow you, when you do raise your funding, right, the first round of funding, it'll allow you to raise on better terms, right? So that's also really important. You'll also just have time go by, which allows you to field more questions from all the different people in your field, whether they're like customers or investors or people who want to come and work at your company or whatever it is, right? So you'll just be better armed in those fundraising conversations from all standpoints. So that is that's a little bit about when to start fundraising.
Yep.
I very fortunate again, because I was working full time as a doctor. I was making enough to like support the whole team until we got to like 8 or 9 people, right? So we didn't have to like go and raise big money. I just, you know, obviously would have to put in a bunch of cash, but that's, you know, you just, if you want your thing to work, then you just do whatever it is that you got to do. And so the important conversation here is how do you go about raising those first checks, I think, right? And so assuming that's part of this question, or do you want me to wait for
Yeah, I mean, the next question from Lu Chen, who I think is also on the call, he's asking sort of your strategy to raise the capital and how did you get started? Maybe some tactical advice if you have such.
Okay, yeah, that's a
Lu Chen, feel free to jump in if you want to add more context to your question.
So just to start there, there's a belief in startup circles, well, in circles that are sort of early stage, that you need to go out and raise a bunch of VC. It's either like a feather in the cap or a mark of approval or a success milestone, but it's not any of those things. And in fact, I would really recommend people deferring raising VC for as long as possible, if not forever, right? And there's lots of reasons, but let me just say that I was one of those people who thought like, no, I'm gonna just like start a company and then we'll raise a bunch of VC and everything will be great and I'm gonna hire all these people and it's gonna be awesome. But in actual fact, like that versus what makes a company successful, those are like not together, right? Those are two separate things. And so the key guiding principle there is that VCs are not aligned with early companies' goals, right? What VCs exist for, right? You guys know this. LPs put money in. The idea is that there's like a 10 to 100x return, right? Which means that the VCs are like, we're going to press on every single one of our companies to like see if their internal sort of unit economics work in such a way that they're going to return a huge amount of value for me just by me pouring money in. In other words, you should only seek VC if for every dollar you put into your company, right, of capital, more than that comes out, right? If it's going down because you're not yet at a growth stage, then you should not go and get VC, right? In most cases. In some cases, people go and get VC for other reasons so that they can build to that stage, but in most cases, you shouldn't. So the question is, what do you, and then the other side of the spectrum is founders and startups, and what are we after, right? Well, we're after building a really solid company that is really healthy and profitable. And what we're doing by taking VC too early is we're robbing ourselves of the chance to get to that stage, right? So a lot of companies, a lot more than current, would get to that stage if they didn't take VC. but a lot of the companies that you see die, right? Remember the metric is like 90% die in the first year or whatever it is. Some percentage of those guys wouldn't die if they didn't take VC. And that's because they've essentially gotten in bed with, they've married people who have completely different values at the moment than them, right? And so that's the caution there. VCs can add some things. VCs can add network, they could add introductions, they could add things like that, but you can do all those things on your own in the early days, right? Just by like LinkedIn hacking or like, you know, HBS network hacking or just like whatever it is. There's so many ways to get cash, right? Cash is like the easy thing. Just to give you a bit more actionable stuff, what should you do in the early days? You should 100% go with angels, high net worth people who care about your space. Like I said, what you're doing in the early days is you're building a brand, you are validating ideas, you are looking for people who care about you and want to back you and your team and your vision. And that's not what a VC does, but that's what an angel does. Angels who will invest in your company are typically really, really well connected. And like the good news that is like a inexorable truth is that rich people hang out with rich people. And so all of my angels that have come in have said, oh, hey, I have this other friend who typically co-invests with me. And then boom, you've raised like a crap load of cash just with like one email or one conversation, right? Obviously there's the diligence and stuff like that happens, but angels, getting your first one through an introduction from a startup founder that you are good friends with or something like that, who has raised money from these guys before. When I say guys, I mean it in an inclusive way, guys and gals. But yeah, so we should talk more about this, but I want to give you the chance to ask more questions. This is an area I'm very passionate about because
yeah, definitely. I mean,
it's where lots of people make mistakes.
For sure. A question in the chat from Jujubi. She's asking angels versus VC. If you could share a little more about the company structure. Maybe you were a Delaware C Corp or an LLC, and then also if there's a compensation calculator.
So according to so I'm going to share all the resources. So don't worry about that, guys. I'll send that out. In terms of like the advice that works well for most people, right? It's just the bell curve, right? So 67% and then 12 or whatever, the 13% to 12.5% on either side, right? So we're going to cover like the middle of the bell curve and then the 12.5, right? So for most people, yeah, we could talk about LLCs, we could talk about S corps, and we could talk about nonprofits and not for profits. But like, if you want to get investment in your company from every country in the world, essentially, like you don't want to close yourself off from Canada and Europe and Hong Kong, and right, you want to be open, and obviously the US. So C corp is my preferred incorporation, but like, and that'll be the case for 99% of people. But if there's a particular reason why you need to look elsewhere, then only you would know that.
Great. Next question from Harrison is asking how much of your overall time was dedicated to fundraising? And I mean, did you get customers first? At what point did you kind of, focus just on fundraising? Because as a CEO, you have so many other things to do.
Yeah. I love fundraising. Nobody you ever meet again will ever say that, but I love fundraising. And it's because you get to meet lots of amazing people who are doing crazy cool things, who like, it's always a great conversation. So if you are winning and you are doing something really cool, then fundraising is awesome, right? In terms of how much of my time spent doing it, and the reason I brought up that it's awesome is because I used to have to spend a reasonable amount of time doing it. So it's important that you actually find ways to enjoy it if you're going to be doing it for a while. So my first fundraise, I don't know, it was like 10, 15 hours a week-ish for like 4 months, right? It wasn't crazy. But what happened was, and this is probably because of Harvard, doing this online demo day that was really helpful, we ended up getting these 3 billionaire families in the mix early as some of our biggest supporters, right, as investors. And so basically the agreement we have with them is like, as long as we keep meeting our milestones, they keep putting cash in. So fundraising now is pretty simple. It takes like a day or 2 days or whatever of actual work. And so this is another reason why it's important to find people who are super aligned with you and your mission early, rather than like totally destroying your cap table with all of these VCs and terms and drag along and liquidation and all of this crap. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
I'm not saying that it's going to be super easy for everybody. I'm not saying that you should never do VC early. I'm just saying that the better you can set yourselves up early, the fewer doors you close going forward.
Great. So we often get advice here from some of our guests that, to talk to investors that really understand your space. Did you seek out edtech specific investors or AI specific investors? How did that work out?
Yeah, so that is a good question. So in my opinion, every company has a data play, right? We don't live in the year 2019 anymore, right? We live in 2020, which, although it's a terrible, terrible year for the whole world, what is really clear is that your company can and should have a data play, right? And so that all of a sudden drastically expands the pool of investors who are open to you and interested in your product, right? If you have a very coherent way of using data to improve some outcome for people and lower the amount of work that they have to do. People love doing no work, um, as we should, right? Like the world is bigger than work. Then you again, you close fewer doors, right? That's a really important recurring theme. So you could look for just education people, or you could look for just, I don't know, health tech or fintech or whatever people, but
Mm.
you just don't close yourself off from the bigger story available to you.
Great. Before we get into sort of where Sophia is now, I'm going to combine two questions from Mary Winston and Chandel. They're pretty much asking sort of your advice on fundraising tactics during COVID now, and then how do you appeal to the funders during this economic downturn?
Yeah, this is a big one. So, and I'll send out a really good resource for this. Really, really good. But the bullet points are that you should have more runway than you think you need, right?
Mhm.
So I obviously don't know what company sizes you guys have, but if you can plan to run all of your calculations on zero revenue, even if you're bringing in $1 million a year, right? Like you're at that kind of early stage, then great. But you still shouldn't count any of that money in your calculations of runway, because you never know what's going to happen for your customers that will require them to cut their spending, right? So never count revenue. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you should always have, not always, but you should have for the next foreseeable future, have like 2 years of runway in the bank, right? So runway, as I'm sure you know, is like the amount of money you spend every single month times whatever, like how much you have in the bank, essentially, like how many months that will last you, given your costs. So so during COVID, that's especially important. In normal times, it was okay to have like 8 months to a year of runway. But if you don't have 2 years of runway minimum in the bank, 22 months of runway minimum in the bank, it's going to be really hard for you to feel settled, you and your team to know that you're going to weather the storm. Because remember, it's COVID, it's like riots, it's global recession. Like this isn't something that is very simple,
Mhm.
right? And I'm not like a sky is falling kind of guy, but like, you always have to plan for. The last thing that I'll say on that is, um, what was the last thing I was going to say on that? Oh, if if your business is actually, to just answer the second part of your question,
Mhm.
which is what do you say to investors? If you're in a business that is going like this, right? Like video conference education stuff,
Mhm.
um, I don't know, like some health tech stuff, right? Then great, right? The story for your investors is pretty cut and dry, right? So
Mhm.
you don't really have to worry about it. if you're asking the question, I'm assuming that it's not the case, right? And so you just have to really ask yourself if, like, right now you need to increase any burn that would require bringing in investment, right? Because it's obviously a tough time to do that. And B, if you do get as far as getting to like a term sheet with investors, or a safe note or whatever it is, you should not be too crazy with your demands, right? Don't do anything that will totally screw up your company. Like, don't do a 4x liquidation preference. Don't do like things like that. But don't form a board if you don't need to, right? But don't not do terms that kind of suck, and that have a little bit lower valuation than you would like, because you don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. And all of your staff who look at you for support and safety during COVID, they would all be very grateful if you probably took that deal. So there's a lot to balance here, and it's really going to depend on your company and where you're at. But just don't get too cute with deals, was the quote that I read.
Speaking of board, you mentioned that. How would you kind of advise building your advisory board? Do you have any advice on that and compensating those advisors?
So there's a difference, and this is kind of probably what you're getting at, Joe, but there's a difference between a board of directors who have a fiduciary responsibility to your company. In other words, if they don't do the right thing, that an objective person would say is the right thing for your company, they could go to jail, right? So that's board of directors. Advisory board or board of advisors is totally different. There's no fiduciary responsibility. It's like totally different. And so there's a really good document that I can include in the resources that I send out that help people to understand what level of compensation for what level of work and involvement each board of advisor person should have. I'll send that out. But in general, board of advisor people will return very little value to you, because there's no impetus for them to actually do their thing, right? To help you in any way. They may love you, they may be great supporters, but I would think twice about bringing in a board of advisor person and compensating them with equity, unless it was like very few specific circumstances. And you would also have to be very clear in your contract with them. And the document that I'll send you guys has very clear terms in it. So I'll cover you there.
Great. You mentioned earlier maybe another founder referring you to an investor. What gets you excited? Let's say another founder wanted to approach you and ask for, your feedback or a connection to another investor. What's making you excited these days?
Yeah. So the biggest things that get me excited, which then opens the door for me to then pass people on to my investors, is this a really great, like, essentially the question that I'm always asking, and it sounds terrible, right? But like, do I want to make this person rich? Right? Like, it sounds terrible, right? But that's actually the way that I approach my investors too. If they're like a dick, then I'm like, I'll pass on this investor, right? Because I don't want to do anything that will contribute to this person making wealth, right? And it sounds terrible, but like, I really want to reinforce like human values, right? So to be kind to people, help people if you can, like, do everything you can to be like a functioning member of society that contributes to other people in meaningful ways and is just totally kind to everybody, right? And so the first question that I ask is, does this person share those types of values as me? Or is it like a me before we person? And if that's what I get, then I typically, I'm like, I don't care how excited about the idea I am, I would rather not, right? So that's like my first bar. The second bar is, does this unlock a lot of good sort of socioeconomic movement for a lot of people who are previously disempowered, or who don't necessarily have a voice? Or will this help that group of people? Because that's most of the planet, right? Will this help that group of people at scale? If so, then great. I'm happy to generally pass that on if there's a fit. So the founders have to be like outstanding people who are human factor focused. be, it has to be a big space, and generally that is data related, AI related, or cybersecurity, or privacy, or something like that, or healthcare. And then C is, do I have investors who would also be excited by this? And if all three are a match, then I make introductions.
And you would respond to a cold email, for example, if somebody reached out?
It depends. So if it's like somebody who I think like genuinely has done their homework and is like, I feel wants to actually develop a relationship, then absolutely. If it's somebody I feel who is me before we, then probably not. Although I'd probably say something nice back to them.
Since you love people and everything.
Yeah.
So you've been really active on LinkedIn, now during the COVID times, and really, I think you're trying to help education in general. And you mentioned the marginalized, underrepresented students. What's Sophia doing? Like, what do you see the vision of how Sophia is impacting education? You've been giving a lot of advice to higher education, and you're doing awesome work. So just kind of tell us about some of that.
Sure. Yeah. So the beauty of machine learning is that when you apply it to a field in an appropriate way, it can do crazy things for that field. So for those of you guys who know this, and probably everybody has a sense of this, if you don't know your learner, it's really, really hard to target help to your learner, right? So to be more concrete about that, like, what Sophia does is it essentially analyzes every learner to figure out where their gaps are. What do you know? What do you not know? And, it asks the person, what level are you and what level do you want to get to? So I'm in grade 10 and I want to be a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer or whatever it happens to be. So the person can nominate that. And then what we do is we look into our databases that essentially have data from, tens of thousands of people who have walked that same path as them. And it says, okay, great, we can put together this learning path for you, or a series of learning paths to help get you from where you are to where you want to get to. And that's informed by students who are successful and got there. So it's essentially, another analogy is we call it like a GPS for learning, right? So it helps you to know where you are and helps you get to where you need to get to. And so what we're doing in COVID is we're saying, look, the experience that we provide for students is so much more engaging and modern and in line with the type of technology that they expect. They can't be logging on to Blackboard or Canvas or Moodle and being expected to not drop out of school. That's not what you pay $50,000 a year for, right? But when you have a platform that is engaging, that looks just like all your other technologies, this sounds silly, but that is emoji filled, right? It just feels more you. It feels like a place you can spend time. And so we're seeing students with ridiculous, sort of unprecedented numbers, levels of engagement. And when students want to engage with how you're teaching them, they're not going to drop out of school, right? And so we've heard that from students directly. And so what we're telling schools is, hey, first of all, if you're a HBCU, right? So a historical Black college or university, or a community college, or a place that sort of traditionally serves marginalized populations, first of all, we'll offer you our software for free, right? And there's no catch there. The second, so that's sort of separate to COVID, but sort of related. And what we're doing for schools during COVID is we're saying, hey, you guys are literally going to lose billions of dollars in revenue because 15% of your students are going to drop out because your online learning systems aren't really doing the job. We can help you save a huge percentage of that, right? Certainly in the tens of millions of dollars per school, because we can prevent lots of dropouts from happening because of how engaging our software is for your students. So that's kind of the long and the short of what we're doing in COVID.
Great. We've kind of come to the close of our session, but I wanted to kind of finish up with a question from Nick Gavin. He's asking, what's the single most important takeaway you have for us, whether it's on the startup side or something else?
Yeah. So this is a great question. So there's two things. One is, this is not an easy job. So all of you guys better strap in, because if it was easy to build a great startup, everybody would do it. And so I'm very happy that there are so many people on this call who want to make a difference and who are literally putting their time down to do that. So it's not easy. Surround yourself with great people and keep your eye on the ball, and just keep going. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, you know, business is built on relationships, right? We got all of our first customers and our continuing customers because of relationships. We got all of our ridiculous investors because of great relationships. Everything you do will be a factor of how you represent yourself and how you treat other people. So if you continue to treat people really, really well, like you will have no limit. So those are my two things.
That's amazing, amazing. Thank you so much. I shared your Twitter in the chat. Is there any specific call to action that you would like from the community?
Well, keep building. That's the first one. Second, I will send out some resources, I think, through Joe and Regina. So look out for that.
Sure.
The other sort of business related one is, we would love to help as many schools as possible. So if you, whether it's K to 12 or higher ed, whatever your alma mater was or your current school, or if you're involved with any school, please get in touch, and we would love to help those schools, especially during this crazy COVID time when a lot of them would shut down if we don't help save them some revenue.